Amber's medical examination, she was cooperative, correct?
Her psychological, yes, she was cooperative and polite.
Okay. And in the 2 full days of examination, you felt she was polite and answered all your questions, except in one instance where she furrowed her brow when you were asking about friendships in high school, correct?
That's not correct.
All right, let's go to page 275. So we start on 274 with the, was she polite? You said yes. Was she cooperative? Yes. Did she answer your questions? For the most part, yes. This is, now we're on page 275, lines 4 and 5. And then my question was, did she at any time become combative or unfriendly with you or angry? And your answer was, there was one instance in which she appeared annoyed and the posturing forward a bit, more assertive tone, furrowed brow, when I was questioning something, following up on data that had been inconsistent about friendships in high school. Other than that, she was very polite. Is that your answer at that time?
That was my answer at that time, and it's inconsistent with the question you had just asked me.
And would you agree that appearing for this examination with an expert who had been retained by Mr. Depp more than a year earlier might be a little stressful?
Yes.
Okay. And in fact, not only had you been retained by Mr. Depp, but what had been communicated by Mr. Depp's team was that you had called Amber Heard a liar and a perpetrator of abuse, correct?
First of all, I'd like to clarify that I was not retained by Mr. Depp. I was retained by Mr. Depp's counsel. And what I can say that, yes, any examinee in a forensic context, you would consider that they're probably stressed.
And it's common for the perpetrator to essentially gaslight the victim, accuse them of being the perpetrator. Would you agree?
Are you in a different area, or are you asking me a separate question?
I'm asking you a question.
Oh.
And it's common.
Sorry, can you please repeat it?
Yes. And it's common for the perpetrator to essentially gaslight the victim, accuse them of being the perpetrator. Would you agree? That's exactly how it was asked in the deposition. So
I understand it is a compound question. I was the objection.
And it's common for the perpetrator to essentially gaslight. I don't think that's, Your Honor, it's this, I think it's just one question. Let me try it. To gaslight the victim, isn't it?
That's a characteristic of psychological abuse, yes.
Okay, and it's common then for them to accuse them of being the perpetrator, the victim.
That's a characteristic of abuse from women perpetrated against men. It's actually very, very common. About 90% of male victims of IPV have reported that a female partner who abuses them makes threats to report their partner as an abuser. It's less common for men to make that statement to female partners just because there's less potential consequence.
Isn't it true, though, that some form of gaslighting is often present in these personality-based IPV scenarios?
Yes.
Okay. And it's distressing for the victim to be accused, is it not?
Absolutely.
It causes them a lot of fear?
Certainly.
And it causes them a lot of distress?
Absolutely, yes.
And in fact, they feel falsely accused, correct?
Yes.
And they feel paranoid?
Yes.
And they feel frightened?
Yes.
Afraid that everyone's going to believe the perpetrator, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, they're afraid they're going to lose their security, correct?
Can you clarify what you mean by security?
Well, that's the next one. And they're afraid they're going to lose their reputation, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's talk about the testing for a moment. You talked about the MMPI-2, but that's not the most recent MMPI, is it?
No, it's the most researched.
Okay. Now, you need to have an elevated, on the MMPI, there was only one section that had elevated scores, correct?
No, that's not correct.
It was the K section, correct?
That's not correct.
Okay. And was there any elevated score over 65 on the MMPI?
I would need to take a look at it. If, you know, I provided a 25-page interpretation outline. If you're able to pull that up, I'd be happy to go over any of the individual scores for you.
Can you recall any clinical scales for the MMPI-2 for Amber Heard that were above 65 as you sit there today?
Again, there are multiple scales on this test, 25 pages worth listed. So if you can pull it up, then I can review and give you a confident answer.
What can you recall as you sit there?
I'm hesitant to do that because I don't want to make an error by ignoring hundreds of scale scores.
And would you agree that you can't make a pathological determination or diagnosis if the scales are not elevated on the MMPI-2?
I would not agree with that.
Okay. Now, one of the answers that Amber gave is that it's hard for her to feel safe, correct?
Are you talking about the MMPI-2?
Yes.
Again, I don't recall. There are 567 items on that. I would need to see her results.
Well, it's a common trauma symptom, isn't it, to not feel safe?
Sure.
And safety concerns are common among women who have been victimized, correct?
Women and men, yes.
Okay, and common especially for sexually victimized people. Would you agree?
Any type of victimization, yes.
Okay, and hard to trust. That's a common after effect of interpersonal violence related trauma, correct?
Sure.
And memory difficulties. Amber said she felt she had holes. Do you recall that?
I do. And her account was different than typical memory difficulties with trauma.
You have not made any determinations, including any of opinions that Ms. Heard abused Mr. Depp or Mr. Depp abused Ms. Heard, correct?
Correct. That's outside of the scope of psychology.
Okay. And you cannot testify whether Amber Heard suffered any emotional distress as a result of any of the defamatory comments that she has alleged Mr. Waldman made through Mr. Depp made through Mr. Waldman, correct?
What I can testify is that there was no indication of a decline in psychological functioning showing any injury since she's been with Mr. Depp.
You cannot testify one way or the other on that, correct? Your Honor, may we approach?
Okay.
Hey, you're a lawyer.